Good afternoon, everyone. This is Kathy Neifeld with Agency One. It's just 12 o'clock. We are going to start at 12:02. We are expecting a lot more people to dial in. So I appreciate your patience. If you would give us another 2 minutes, and we are going to get started at 12:02. Thank you. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. This is Kathy Neifeld with Agency One, and I am pleased to bring you the continuation of our afternoon webinars. And today we're pleased to have an economist that is going to be introduced by our friends at Symetra, specifically Steve Patrizio, who is the regional VP for the Northeastern region for Symetra. And I'm going to turn it over to Stephen to introduce our speaker. I would ask everyone to, if you've got any questions, please type them into the question box, and we will address them at the end of the presentation. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Stephen. Thank you.
Thanks, Kathy, very much. And thank you, everybody, for showing up. I appreciate it. And I know that everyone's got a lot of time and a lot of things going on in their hands, don't have a lot of time. So we really appreciate you having the opportunity to come and listen to our speaker today. I had the pleasure of introducing Anirban Basu, the chairman and CEO of the Sage Policy Group. And before I introduce him, I have to just say something. I think as I always review people's accomplishments and backgrounds, I'm always amazed at how little I've accomplished in my life so far. So as always, here's a wonderful outline on Mr. Basu. He's chairman and CEO of the Sage Policy Group, which is an economic and policy consulting firm in Baltimore. Mr. Basu serves as the chief economist to the Associated Builders and Contractors and is chief economic advisor to the Construction Financial Management Association. In 2007 and then again in 2016, Mr. Basu was selected by the Daily Record newspaper as one of Maryland's 50 most influential people. The Baltimore Business Journal named him as one of the region's 20 most powerful business leaders in 2010. Without further ado, here is Mr. Basu to give us his lecture. Thanks so much, sir.
Well, thanks a lot. That's a very nice introduction. Thanks to Agency One and to Symetra for making this all possible and for me to be with you today. It's a privilege to be with you here on August 5th of 2020. We are going to talk about the economy. Interesting times, of course. I've entitled the presentation, Return of the Economist. It is a Lord of the Rings themed presentation, and you will see that theming throughout this presentation. I will leave some time at the end for questions and answers, so please do put in your questions into the chat box, and then those questions will be asked of me at the end. This is your COVID-19 economic update. Now, there are a lot of different ways to begin such an affair. We could recite the Pledge of Allegiance, engage in prayer, maybe sing the national anthem, perhaps an honor guard. I want to start with one of the standbys, the ring verse, which goes thusly: 3 rings for the elven kings under the sky, 7 for the dwarf lords in their halls of stone, 9 for mortal men doomed to die, 1 for the dark lord on his dark throne in the land of Mordor where the shadows lie, 1 ring to rule them all, 1 ring to find them, 1 ring to bring them all, and in the darkness find them. 9, 7, 3, 1. You'll see this organizational framework throughout the webinar. 9 rings for the kingdom of men and women, 7 for the dwarves, 3 for the elves, 1 for the dark lord. I think we can agree that the dark lord has been busy here on Middle Earth in 2020. This is COVID-19 global cumulative confirmed cases. One of the challenges of this period is to know what to believe. And I have faced those challenges too. So for instance, one of the things that I was told back in January and February, at least heard from public health officials, was that the virus doesn't like warm weather, that hot temperatures are a partial antidote to viral spread. You might remember hearing something like that as well. The fact of the matter is, whether we look at places like New York or Minneapolis or Seattle, which emerge as epicenters along with Detroit and Chicago, or now whether we look at epicenters like Houston, Texas, Miami, Florida, Phoenix, Arizona, so on and so forth, whether you're far from the equator or near the equator, India, Brazil, seeing spikes in cases on an ongoing basis, Southern Europe as well. This has affected humanity and, of course, has had an impact on the world. And so here we are, still in the midst of this crisis, and we'll talk about the economic implications of that. One of the things I want to do is I want to set the baseline. So if we're going to talk about economic recovery, what are we trying to get back to? The hope, of course, is that we get back to where we had been, because where we had been was a very extraordinary place, at least if you look at the headline numbers. And if you're going to start with the pre-existing strength of the US economy pre-COVID-19, I think you start with the labor market. This is monthly job growth in America. We added jobs for 113 consecutive months pre-crisis. In February, we added a bit more than 250,000 jobs. That is when the recession is dated to have begun. We'll talk more about that. But in February itself, we actually added jobs. I would argue, too, that the crisis began on March 9th. You say, that's pretty specific. Yeah, it's pretty specific. And you might also say, that's wrong, because they call it COVID-19 for a reason, sir. It began in 2019. Fair point. But I say March 9th because up until that point, a lot of people didn't even notice that there was this emerging pandemic, certainly not the stock market. But on March 9th, the Dow Jones, which had been pretty steady coming into that day, falls 2,000 points, more than 2,000 points. And at that time, that was a daily point decline record for the Dow Jones Industrial Average. We set new records, as it turns out, on March 12th and also on March 16th. It wasn't until March 11th that the Utah Jazz are ushered away from the basketball court when it's determined that their all-star center, Rudy Gobert, is COVID-19 positive. A few days later, his fellow all-star guard forward, Donovan Mitchell, is diagnosed with COVID-19. The Utah Jazz are a very good team. And that's roughly when the NBA scuttles its season, at least temporarily. So, that's when it really begins. And in March itself, our nation loses 1.4 million jobs as the economy begins to shut down. In April, the nation loses 20.8 million jobs, which is why I put the data here on two separate axes. On the left, everything through February of 2020. On the right, March, April, May, and June. Because April's decline was so severe, 20.8 million jobs, if I tried to graph that data point on one axis, all these other vertical lines would effectively disappear. So we had added during the previous 113 months of uninterrupted job creation, 22 million jobs. We lost in March and April, 22 million jobs. But lo and behold, something happened. Economists had been predicting that in May, the nation lost 8 million jobs or would lose 8 million jobs. We added 2.7 million and then followed that up with 4.8 million jobs in June. And I would argue to you that the recession is over. Because when you have such profound rates of job growth, that's not consistent with recession. Now, we'll talk about the outlook going forward, but just some history here. So we've recovered, at least through June, about a third of the jobs that we lost during the previous 2 months. Now, don't get me wrong, we're still very far away from recovery. On March 24th of this year, the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis released some results of its study on who was vulnerable to layoff during this crisis. So this is March 24th, it's pretty early days. But they looked at 144.7 million jobs. If you look at the first bolded row here, employed in occupations at low risk of layoff, about 54% of employment at low risk of layoff. Employed in occupations at high risk of layoff, that other bolded row there just below, 46%. And who are these workers who are at high risk of layoff? Well, it's obvious, isn't it? People in food preparation, that's your restaurant worker. People in sales, that's your retail worker. And that's precisely who's been hardest hit by this. So yes, we added jobs in May, we added jobs in June, But between June of 2019 and June of 2020, we were still down 13 million jobs. We don't yet have July data. No one does. So if you look at this by category, you'll notice that the sector that's lost the most jobs is leisure and hospitality. That's mostly hotel and restaurant workers. About 4.5 million jobs lost in that category. The second category includes retail trade, wholesale trade, transportation, and utilities. That includes, by the way, job growth generated by Amazon, which is also in this, but that does not fully offset all the jobs lost in retail, down nearly 2 million jobs on a year-ago basis. But every sector of the economy has lost jobs over the past 12 months for which we have data, and again, we're down about 13 million jobs. This is employment growth or lack thereof for the 25 largest metropolitan areas in our country. Now, this is interesting, I think. Where do we see the least amount of job loss in percentage terms? Phoenix, Mesa, Scottsdale, Arizona, followed by 5 other southern cities: Dallas, San Antonio, Tampa, Atlanta, Houston. Now, in many cases, these were not the initial epicenters of viral spread. That would be New York Metro. You can see at number 25 here, has lost 15.4% of its jobs, or did, between June of 2019 and June of 20. Detroit, Michigan, a viral epicenter, 12.9%. Chicago, viral epicenter, Cook County, 9.7%. Orlando is here. It's a southern city, but Orlando is largely what? Retail trade, leisure, and hospitality. So structurally, it was vulnerable, and you can see the effects of that in these data. But what's happened since? The viral epicenters of March and April are not necessarily the viral epicenters of today. Today, it is the southern United States, places like Miami, so on and so forth, Miami at number 8. And some of these states are reversing their reopenings. And so this means that, relatively speaking, you might see some of these northeastern cities climb into this first column with less steep job loss, and some of these southern cities climb into the right-hand column going forward. Well, such is the nature of a national or global pandemic. So unemployment by April has risen to 14.7%. Unlike the previous economic downturn, the Great Recession, one in which men suffered more, relatively speaking, men aligned with industries like construction and manufacturing, which really took it on the chin. This time has been different. Female-dominated industries, leisure, hospitality, retail, daycare centers, private education, so on and so forth, have been affected. And an easy majority of American nurses are women. So many women have been on the front lines of delivering care, and they sometimes have become sick themselves delivering that care. These are amongst our heroes. And so this time is different. So the unemployment rate, as I say, in April rose to 14.7% overall here shown in red. Male unemployment, however, has tended to be lower than female unemployment. By June, unemployment had fallen to 11.1% overall, but the unemployment rate for women in America closer to 12%, for men closer to 10%. So each expansion cycle is different, each recession is different, and this one is no different along that dimension. It's different as well. Now, this is unemployment rates for those same 25 largest metropolitan areas. Who has the lowest unemployment rate among the 25 largest metropolitan areas in the country? My region, Baltimore, 8%. We have a lot of medical centers here, a lot of federal government agency employment, a lot of federal government contractors, a lot of people who are able to work remotely. And so this result prevails. But unemployment is high everywhere, is my point. In Los Angeles, 18.1%. And obviously, it's going to take a long time to get back to where we have been, that 50-year low in unemployment, 3.5%, right? We were at 3.5% unemployment pre-crisis, a 50-year low. You would have to go back to December of 1969 to find unemployment as low as it had been pre-crisis. And just to give you a sense of how long ago that was, the Orioles were good back then. That just gives you some sense of how long ago that was. So it's going to take us a long time. And we'll talk more about the recovery, the forecast, in a moment. Again, I'm trying to set that statistical baseline, what recovery, full recovery would look like. Now, one of the other neat things about the recovery as it had been is that, well, employees were in high demand, right? Human capital was in high demand. The typical complaint among businesses coming into this crisis, and that's maybe true for certain insurers as well, is can't find good workers. We had more job openings in this country pre-crisis than we had unemployed people. And so when demand is high and supply is low, price tends to rise. This is growth in wages and salaries as measured by the US Employment Cost Index. And what I'm just trying to show you is the fact that people were making more money on the job. Right? Costs were rising as unemployment was falling. So what have I said so far? Well, pre-crisis, as you know, more people working, more people making more money on the job. Amazon is not a 501c3. It's not a charitable organization. So when they raise their minimum wage to $15 an hour minimum, and remember, they're all across the country. So in some parts of the country, $15 is actually quite a bit as a minimum. So when they do that, they do not do it for charitable purposes. They do it for business reasons. It's a reflection of what had been a very strong labor market and the fact that it was more difficult to recruit and retain talent. So when Americans have more money in their pockets, more people working, more people making more money on the job, what do? We're Americans. We go shopping. We put stuff in the baggins. This is US retail sales. Now, US retail sales climb on a monthly basis through January. They start to slip in February, because by February, you'll note that some of us had started to social distance. You remember that? We started, if we went to meetings, we'd start with, if we greeted each other, we'd do the fist pump, and then we did the elbow bump, and then we did the kid and play toe tap, if you know what I'm talking about, which I think you do. And so by that point, people are backing off from engaging the economy, and we see some slippage in February retail sales. March, things start falling off the table. April, even worse. That's the worst month. April was the worst month of this crisis. And that was actually when American mobility was at its nadir. If you track cell phone movements, that was when Americans were least mobile, the most shut in. And of course, that's going to tend to affect retail. Now, what happens? May, surge in retail sales. And then look at the last skinny bar here, that's June. You see retail sales at almost pre-crisis levels. And if you look carefully there, ladies and gentlemen, you can actually see maybe even the letter V for victory. I'm not saying we've won this, right? I will not say mission accomplished, not yet. But what I will say is that the early phase of recovery was really very dramatic. And that's important in trying to understand where this economy is likely to be headed going forward. But we'll come back to this. Now, unfortunately, because the virus did a head fake, what do I mean by that? Well, the first epicenters were places like New York and Seattle. Those places flattened the curve of infection. Southern areas were not as affected initially. So in late April, for instance, Governor Kemp in Georgia starts reopening his state. I'm not saying he did it too quickly or not. That's not my debate. Governor DeSantis in Florida follows suit shortly thereafter. I think thinking that, well, this is a northern issue, that warm weather, it's an antidote. And so they reopened their economies quickly. And guess where the epicenters now are of viral spread? So one of the things that we've been looking at as economists, and others look at this too, is high frequency data. Here's some high frequency data. It comes out every day. US restaurant reservations. Now, what's this green line? It's year-over-year percentage change in seated reservations. You'll note that by April, we were at a negative 100%, no reservations. Now, my staff in creating this slide put the y-axis to a negative 120%. I don't know why you can't get to negative 120%. Set that aside. So things stay flat for quite some time, through April. And then you can see restaurant reservations start to pick up. We start to look more and more like last year in terms of seated reservations. But if you look at this line since, mid-June or so, late June, what do you see here? It's really flattened out. We've stopped making progress. And why is that? It's because the virus has reemerged, especially in the American South, and people are not able to or willing to engage the economy. So this economic expansion that had been so strong in May and June and reveals the economy's recuperative power has begun to go sideways, and that's too bad. Finally, the miracle of the previous economic cycle. Now, I'm speaking to a group of financial professionals. So you'll remember from economics, one of the things you learned was that when unemployment goes down, inflation goes up. It's the Phillips curve. And when I was tested on the Phillips curve, and maybe your experience was similar in college, it was not an essay question. It is not, Anirban, tell me about your feelings about the Phillips curve. What emotions do you sense pouring from you when you hear about the Phillips curve? This notion that when unemployment falls, inflation goes up. No, it was true, false. True. True or false? When unemployment goes down, inflation goes up. True, professor, done. So if I tell you that there's a 50-year low in unemployment at 3.5%, and I remind you that during the previous economic downturn, the Great Recession, the Federal Reserve created incredible amounts of new money supply, you'd say, well, based on that, we have to have an inflation problem. Now, this is inflation as measured by the core CPI, the core consumer price index. And what I'm trying to show you here with this purple line is that prior to the crisis, inflation each year was running between 1.5% and 2.5%. Well, that's not problematic. In fact, that's in the sweet spot. The Federal Reserve's target for inflation is 2%. In fact, the Federal Reserve has been so unconcerned by inflation that last year the Federal Reserve cut rates not once, not twice, but thrice, even as we marched toward that 50-year low in unemployment. Now, you'll notice that inflation since has fallen further. The issue right now is disinflation or deflation. We can talk about inflation, and I think we'll be talking more about inflation in a couple of years because of all this money supply creation, because of all this federal government deficit spending, and because the economy generally will be healthier by that point, I presume. But right now, that's not the issue. And when inflation is low, interest rates tend to be low, and they're hobbit-sized. This is the yield on the 10-year Treasury, the most liquid bond in the world. That interest rates have fallen during the crisis. Well, yeah, because people have been scared, and this is a way to take risk out of a portfolio. I think we would agree that this creates enormous difficulties for insurance companies, right? Because what do I need to do? I get premiums. I need to invest those premiums, generate a return, so that when I have to pay out life insurance or whatever it happens to be, those benefits, the money is there. But imagine putting together a portfolio right now if you manage insurance investments or insurance company investments. Where do you put your money? If you put it in US equities, taking a lot of risk with money that you really can't risk, has to be there. If you put it in bonds, the rate of return is very, very low. If you put it with hedge fund managers, that's challenging because hedge fund managers generally underperform the market. A really challenging environment. But if you're trying to create a cycle of consumers borrowing and businesses borrowing to spend that money, low interest rates are helpful. And we certainly had that pre-crisis, and we have it even more now. But again, this is in part a function of those low inflation rates. So when you got more people working, you got low cost of capital, among other things, you're going to get rising property values, right? This is the S&P Case-Shiller U.S. National Home Price Index. And in fact, if you spoke to realtors pre-crisis, what might they have said to you? Look, I got lots of people looking for homes. I have baby boomers downsizing. I've got millennials looking to form households, looking at the suburbs for the first time. I got nothing to show them. The inventory of unsold homes is low. So when demand is high, supply is low, prices rise. That's what you see here. And that also spurs more economic activity because when prices are rising, builders want to build. So if you're in property and casualty, for instance, the more property we're adding, the more property there is to have insured. Ultimately, that translates into more premiums paid to somebody. This is U.S. residential building permits. You need a permission to build, of course, from a relevant government agency before you can build a home or whatever it happens to be. You notice here that residential building permits were really spiking late last year into 2020. Why? Well, because home builders who pre-crisis enjoyed a level of confidence at a 20-year high understood that people are looking for homes, can't find them. The inventory of unsold homes is low. So this was an opportunity for home builders to meet unmet demand. Fantastic. If you think about the stock market finally, as just ending this part of the presentation, the baseline, this is the Dow Jones index to the right, the NASDAQ and the S&P to the left. The NASDAQ, as you may have heard, set an all-time record today and screaming towards 11,000, right now 10,977.39 as I'm speaking to you at this moment. But so more people making more money on the job, spending more money. Property values rising, assuming, of course, they own property. Their portfolios rising in value. You remember that joke everyone used to tell during the Great Recession? You remember that joke? My 401k is not a 201k. Remember that joke? Everyone told that joke. By the way, no one ever laughed at that joke, ever. But then the 201k became an 801k. And that wasn't funny, but it was fun. I entitled this slide, but it goes to Elvin to pay homage to the fact that Lord of the Rings has lots of elves, but also to fully understand the title of this slide, you'd have to harken back to a movie that came out in 1984 called This is Spinal Tap. And if you understand that reference, this becomes hilarious. But even if you don't, the point is all systems go coming to this pandemic. And there were some economists who I think really quite naively thought we could get through this public health crisis without a recession. Can you imagine that? And the notion was that this economy had become an irresistible force, just too much momentum. Well, a couple of things to note. One, even as the economy was performing, there were a set of vulnerabilities that had emerged. Let me go through those now. So number one, not all segments of the economy were really participating in the expansion. Agriculture is one good example. Agrarians have had to wrestle with the impact of trade wars, low corn prices, low soybean prices. Many farmers have had to take on enormous amounts of debt to keep themselves going in recent years. Manufacturing is another sector that had been struggling for much of last year. This is the Institute of Supply Management's Purchasing Managers Index. You see the 50-yard line running west and east across the slide. Any reading below 50 means that manufacturing is in recession. And it was in recession for 5 months late last year. Why? Trade war with China, strong US dollar, which among other things frustrates US export growth, a weakening US auto sector, which really peaked in 2016, and then the issues at Boeing with the 737 MAX. But lo and behold, what happens late last year? We get a first phase trade deal with China. We get ratification of the USMCA, the US-Mexico-Canada trade agreement. And we get Boris Johnson's resounding victory in the United Kingdom, which gave us more certitude regarding Brexit and its economic implications. When was the last time you talked about Brexit? You might have talked about Boris Johnson during the pandemic, but not so much Brexit. So all of a sudden, a lot of that uncertainty that was revolving around the US manufacturing sector began to abate. And by January, manufacturing comes out of recession. But then, COVID-19, global supply chain disruptions, and you can see manufacturing dips well below 50 again. And then more recently, as General Motors, Ford, Chrysler reopen their plants, as inventories need to be rebuilt, we'll talk more about this later on in the presentation, all of a sudden manufacturing's out in recession. But again, there was that pre-existing vulnerability coming into the downturn. But I would say that the leading source of vulnerability coming into this period was indebtedness. Who's indebted? Well, who's not? The federal government is certainly indebted. Coming into the crisis, the national government had a $23.5 trillion national debt. Last I checked, it's now screaming towards $27 trillion. But now this comes from the Congressional Budget Office. And this is pre-COVID-19. For instance, the dark blue lines here at the end of the series, that's forecast for the next 10 years with respect to the US federal budget deficit as a percentage of GDP. So pre-COVID-19, pre-CARES Act, and other forms of stimulus, including stimulus to come, we had built in that the federal budget deficit would be around 5%, 4.8% of GDP, not 5% of revenues, 5% of GDP. So, and notice that during this negotiation period for the next stimulus, and I think we will get another stimulus, but one of the issues is, we're constrained because we came into this period with such a large national debt. Imagine if we hadn't. But that's not where the constraints end. Households have never been so indebted. You say, Anirban, how could this be? We added all these jobs, incomes have been rising, so yeah, but we're Americans. And interest rates have been low. And everyone I meet wants a 3-bedroom house with 2.5 baths and a Jeep Cherokee. That's it. And that costs a lot of money. So in orange is mortgage debt. That's that segment. In red is student loans, the second largest form of indebtedness at the household level. Green is auto loans and blue is credit card. But you can see coming into the crisis, a period of massive job loss, we had taken on a lot of debt as a people. So too, as it turns out, had corporate America. Corporate debt has never been so great. They said, Anirban, how is that possible? You just showed a slide with a booming stock market. And even today, the stock market, the Dow is up 266 points as I'm speaking to you right now. So, and did we not cut, corporate taxes in late 2017, and haven't corporate earnings been strong? Yeah. So haven't companies had a lot of cash? Yeah. So haven't they been able to pay down their debt? Yeah, conceivably, but they didn't. Right? Let's say somebody gives you right now, just say a $40,000 bonus. Maybe you pay yourself, but $40,000. You could use that a number of different ways, right? You could use that to pay down some debt, mortgage or whatever it happens to be, but you could also use it as a down payment on your Ferrari. And now you're taking on more debt. And the cash you got allowed you to do that. So one of the ways that companies have taken on more debt is to buy back their shares. You issue debt to buy back the shares, debt goes up, equity goes down. And I get the game, you do too, you're financial professionals. If I can reduce the number of shares outstanding, my earnings per share goes up. That would tend to drive share prices higher, but I am left with a more leveraged balance sheet. And of course, if you're buying a leading competitor, that would also tend to create more indebtedness because often those deals are financed with debt. Now, that's not where it ends. There's some structural issues as well facing the US economy. How about productivity as an issue? Ultimately, people's living standards is a function of their productivity growth, or the growth in their living standards is a function of their productivity growth. From a macroeconomic perspective, economic growth is simply productivity growth plus labor force growth. That's it. Productivity plus labor force. So when I was growing up, I grew up in Kankakee County, Illinois, on the Indiana border. And yes, every bit as exciting as it sounds. When I was growing up, people would say to me, Anirban, because that's my name, Anirban, America grows 3% a year in real terms. That's who we are as a people, 3%. We're a 3% people. Sometimes slower, sometimes faster, sometimes Jimmy Carter is president, sometimes Ronald Reagan, sometimes Bill Clinton, but 3% on average. You ask economists like myself these days, how fast will we grow? On average going forward. Setting aside COVID-19, I'll say less than 2%. Well, why is that? Well, look at the third bullet here. US productivity has risen at an average rate of 1.4% since 2007, compared with a 2.2% average since the end of World War II. We're not becoming more productive as quickly. So right there, that's 0.8 of a percentage point off of potential economic growth. But the labor force is also not growing as quickly. We've had fewer babies in recent decades per woman and per man. We have shifted our immigration policy, and baby boomers are retiring in large numbers. To put all that together, this is why economists often say less than 2% is our economic growth potential. And when you're looking at a $26.5 to $27 trillion national debt, the difference between 2% growth and 3% growth is actually quite substantial in terms of getting out from under that burden. But that's not where the story ends. This is the Global Economic Policy Uncertainty Index. And, right now we're focused on COVID-19, and well, we should be, but there's still other issues out there. So, I started this series with 1998. Remember 1998? I think you do. Remember the next year we partied like it was 1999, because it was, but also Prince told us to. But 1998 was a very special time. The Berlin Wall had fallen. Eastern Europe was regaining its freedom. Free market economics were spreading around the world. And remember the big issue in 1998? You do remember the big issue in 1998. You don't want to say it. You don't want to say it out loud. That's my job. But I'm going to say it. I know you're scared too, but I'm going to say it. Monica Lewinsky, that was a big issue, but hardly a geopolitical threat. But here we are. We've got COVID-19. There's still North Korea. There's still an Iran, apparently moving closer to a nuclear weapon. There's still a France, and those people could be very rude. So there's still issues out there. The world's a more dangerous place than it used to be. At least that's my perception. You note the massive bombing in Beirut. I don't know what happened there. We don't know. We'll see. But it just feels like a more dangerous place. And then finally, the final point of vulnerability I'll mention: high asset prices coming into the crisis. Remember, the Dow Jones was at 29,000 and change coming into the crisis, and it falls to 18,000 like that. This is a Shiller price earnings ratio. What I'm trying to do for you here is I'm trying to juxtapose the price of shares on the S&P 500 vis-a-vis their underlying corporate earnings. And what I'm saying to you here is that pre-crisis, share prices were high relative to earnings based on history. Not as high as in March of 2000, just before the dot-com bust, but high. And they have bounced back, as it turns out. And what goes up can come down. What goes up a lot can come down a lot. Don't get me wrong. The rally that we saw during the 20-teens, that decade of the 20-teens, was justified to a large extent. Some very spectacular things happened. The economy grew. Corporate earnings expanded. America did not have a recession during the previous decade, the first time in American history that we went an entire decade without a recession. Something else special happened. America's share of global output actually rose. For decades, America's share of global output has been in decline. And some of that was engineered. By whom? The Americans. It's the Americans who fashioned the Marshall Plan to help rebuild Europe post-World War II. It's the Americans who spent some of their own treasure to help accelerate Japanese economic recovery from World War II, with the goal being to transform our sworn enemies into our future trading partners, and boy, did it work. Today, Germany is the fourth largest economy in the world, Japan is third, Italy is eighth. But as I said, something very special happened during the previous decade. America's share of global output actually rose from 23% at the beginning of the decade to 25% by decade's end. I know you know that we Americans have some issues. We've seen some of that play out on the streets of America in recent weeks. We've got our national debt, our crumbling infrastructure, our disrupted politics. Okay. But we're home to less than 5% of the world's population and a quarter of its output. Some of us must be doing something right on a daily basis. But does this performance, as remarkable as it is, justify this performance? This is stock market returns by country or region, 2010 to 2019. Now, you may not have agreed with anything I've said thus far, but I think one thing upon which we can agree, a decade has 10 years. If you look at that 256% in red, that's the United States stock market return. Divide that by 10 to get an annual rate of return back in the envelope. Annual rate of return, it's not off the charts because it's literally on the charts, but you get my point. India, which setting aside COVID-19, during a bad economic year grows 6% in real terms, not 2%, 6%, but you wouldn't know it from a stock market performance, nor from the performance of emerging markets generally. So whether I show it to you in absolute terms, price earnings ratio, or relative terms, like I'm showing you here, the market seemed pricey. So again, what seemed like an irresistible force was not that irresistible. It had some vulnerabilities. And then that irresistible force hit an immovable object, and that immovable object is COVID-19, and COVID-19 won. And many economists have tried to compare this episode with previous episodes. So from a stock market perspective, I've heard many economists compare this to October of 1987. Some have tried to compare this to 9/11. Some have tried to compare this to Hurricane Katrina's impacts on New Orleans in 2005. And of course, many have compared this to 2008, 2009. Nonsense, all of it. 2008, 2009 was a demand shock. What happened? The money disappeared. From where? Everywhere. People's home values, people lost their jobs and income, stock market fell, bank balance sheets were affected, money disappeared. The air came out of the balloon. So what did we do? We put air back in the balloon. Right? We passed the Troubled Assets Relief Program to recapitalize the banks. We blew up the Federal Reserve's balance sheet from $800 billion pre-crisis to $4.5 trillion, adding liquidity. And I would argue it worked, because that was the precursor to the lengthiest economic expansion in American history, and we did not have inflation. But this thing is different. This is no demand shock. This is supply shock, and it's a supply shock of a caliber unknown in modern times. It's quarantines. We shut down the malls. This is America, America without malls. What would have happened in the 1980s to Debbie Gibson, you ask? I wonder too, because that's where she made her career, in malls. Travel bans, restrictions, closure of public places, which produces factory closures and cutbacks in service provisions, supply chain disruptions. Now, true enough, as you shut down the economy and 20.8 million jobs are lost in April, that triggers a follow-on demand shock. But first, it doesn't matter what the momentum was of the economy coming into this crisis. We shut it down. Recession, of course, had to ensue. Now, we just went through the worst quarter of our economic lives. You just heard it recently, but during the second quarter of 2020, the economy shrinks 32.9% on an annualized basis, 9.5% on a quarterly basis. So if you look at second quarter output versus first quarter output, second quarter output was down 9.5%. But again, if you annualize that, you get 32.9% with seasonal adjustments. Awful. Again, the last two quarters, the first quarter of 2020 and the second quarter of 2020 indexed to the right, everything else indexed to the left. So what's the recovery look like? Well, one of the things we've been doing is we've been looking at, again, those high frequency data. Now, these data come out each and every week. This series is initial claims for unemployment insurance, initial claims. Now, if you look at the blue segment here, that's pre-crisis. We are running with initial unemployment claims around 210,000 per week. During the week ended March 28th, we had 6.9 million people file for unemployment insurance successfully, right? The following week, around 6.5 million. That's this red line, right? The crisis period. Now, for many weeks thereafter, April into May and so on and so forth, we saw the number of people filing for unemployment declining until the last 2 weeks for which we have data. And in fact, during the week ending July 25th, season-adjusted initial claims stood at 1.4 million, and that was an increase from the previous week. And the previous week was an increase from the previous week to that. But this can be misleading. This is not the whole story. This can be misleading because it is conceivable that someone would lose a job today, file for unemployment insurance successfully tomorrow, and then get a job the next day. I'm not saying it happens often, I'm just saying it's conceivable. So what matters more really than initial claims for unemployment is continuing claims. And what do we see here? Well, good news and bad news. Again, the blue segment pre-crisis. You can see here, at the worst of it, we had about 25 million people on unemployment insurance, and then that begins to decline. But during the week ending July 18th, the last week for which we have these data, we'll get more data in a day, Thursday. These data always come out on Thursday morning. We had, this rose back to 17 million. Why should you care? Because I think you want this economy to recover quickly. I do. And the fact of the matter is, when you look at continuing claims, this means that more people lost jobs than got them. And we ended up with more people on unemployment insurance. And it tells us what? That this economic expansion has begun to stall. And why is that? Because we're still in the midst of this pandemic. And we got to get through it. And I've concluded, and you may differ with me on this, that we're not going to do it through good behavior. We don't seem capable of it. But, in Osceola County, Florida, where I'm headed to tomorrow, as it turns out, they were throwing COVID-19 parties. So anyway, so what do we need? We need a vaccine or something like that. This comes from Goldman Sachs. I have been saying to anyone willing to listen to me that once we got through the pandemic, the recovery would not be L-shaped, would not be U-shaped, not be a check mark, a hockey stick, a square root. No, it's going to be a V once we get through it. And why do I say that? Well, one reason, that's what it has been when other advanced societies have faced something similar. So too many lines on here by half. Again, it comes from Goldman Sachs, but look at that blue line here. So you see the blue line that goes way up to the top and back down again? Hong Kong, SARS, 2003. Hong Kong, SARS, 2003. Now you see that skinny black line at 0%? That's the pre-existing rate of economic growth. So as the epidemic or pandemic hits, what happens? Growth goes below that prevailing average. Well, of course it does. And then, first it's travel, and then it's retail, then it's lodging. But as the pandemic penetrates more segments of the economy, things get worse before they get better. But then what do you see here? A sharp bounce back in economic activity. That's what it has been. Our problem is this. The virus did a head fake. We thought, oh, we flattened the curve. Well, we hadn't. And now, we're still in the midst of it. But, while that V-shaped recovery that we saw in May and June will become dormant to a certain extent, it's still there. It's latent, but it's still there. And I expect, once we get that vaccine, Pfizer in phase 3 clinical trials, Moderna in phase 3 clinical trials, so on and so forth, you're going to see a really sharp bounce back in activity. Another reason to think this is that there's so much stimulus that's taken place and that will continue to transpire. 4 phases of stimulus thus far. The biggie here is phase 3, the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act, or CARES Act. That was a $2.2 trillion package. The Paycheck Protection Program, $1,200 check to some Americans, so on and so forth. And Congress is negotiating another stimulus package right now. Now, do I know what Congress is going to come up with? Of course not. But the Democrats are saying $3.5 trillion, Republicans saying $1 trillion. What's the best guess? $2.25 trillion, something like that. It's coming. It's a presidential election year. And these Congress people, at least the folks in the House of Representatives, are all running for re-election. And they know if they don't get a stimulus package passed, there's a good chance they won't be re-elected. So, so it's coming. So again, if we can get that vaccine and we've got more stimulus in the pipeline, and on top of that, one more consideration before I get to my final slide, U.S. savings rate. So what happens here? In March, April, we shut down the economy. We start sending $1,200 checks to many Americans. And for those who are unemployed, on top of their state unemployment insurance benefits, they get $600 a week. So believe it or not, some people by April had stockpiled a lot of cash. I know that's not the narrative you hear often, but they had stockpiled cash. The economy's closed. They don't have an opportunity to spend. The mall is closed. There's only so much Grubhub you can get, so they're stockpiling cash. The U.S. savings rate had been 8% pre-crisis, goes up to 33% by April. Now, as the economy begins to reopen in earnest by May into June, the savings rate comes back down because people are spending that money. But as of June, the savings rate was still a lofty 19%. There's still a lot of cash out there. So given past history of pandemics, given federal government stimulus, and I hope some of that stimulus includes assistance to state and local governments, which has become a real drag on the economy right now. And then, all this household cash, not every household has cash. I appreciate that. Many people are unable to pay their rent and are facing eviction. I get that. A lot of kids are going back to school remotely. They don't have broadband access. There are all kinds of issues out there. People don't feel safe on mass transit. So many issues. We could go on forever. But there's some positive things here to think about as well. And so, as I say, the initial phase of recovery from this crisis has been sharp, profound, and most welcome. As people enter the economy, interest rates have been remaining low. There's pent-up demand. There's a need to rebuild inventories, like auto dealerships, for instance. And the fact of the matter is we are social animals. People have been anxious to meet again, go to restaurants, go to casinos. Did you see what happened when Las Vegas reopened its casinos? Did you see the madhouse they became? See a movie, watch the Orioles, which is the most beautiful thing a human being can do short of nurturing a child, and engage in other most wonderful human activities. Look, May's jobs report was an absolute stunner and was good for economists like me, who said that the initial phase of recovery would be very strong. I have been disappointed that the virus bounced back. I had been told early in the crisis, look, here's the virus, we'll flatten the curve, but watch out for October, November, December. But no one told me, hey, watch out for June, July, August, so it bounced back. But economists have been expecting 8 million jobs lost in May. As I say, we added 2.7 million. Now, one way to look at that is to say economists missed the mark by 10.5 million jobs. Another way to look at it is that economists missed it by 2 weeks, that people re-engaged the economy more quickly than we thought likely. By the way, I was one of the optimists. And June was even better, that 4.8 million jobs. But as I say, while the recovery has begun, these remain treacherous times. Obviously, we haven't earned an enduring V-shaped recovery. We didn't flatten the curve. So we're probably going to need a vaccine. Come on, Pfizer. Come on, Moderna. Come on, Novavax. Somebody, Bayer AG, Johnson & Johnson, figure it out. Turn on a computer, get out some test tubes, figure it out. Jonas Salk did it in 1955 with polio without a computer and at the age of 40. You can do it too. And then I look forward to 2021, and hopefully I'll have a chance to speak to you all in 2021. And with that, I'm done with my prepared comments, and I'll take questions.
Anirban, thank you very much. That was fascinating, and I see that you end your slide with the ring. So we're all still looking for the ring. The ring will, if you can get the ring, you're in good shape.
Yeah, well, if you like it, put a ring on it. That's what I always say.
Fair enough. If you've got any questions, comments, please type them into the chat box. We do have a question for you, which is, can you please discuss tax policy relative to the enormous national debt that keeps piling up and accelerating due to COVID relief?
Yeah, so there's tax policies economists consider it, which I would call optimal tax policy, trying to get the tax rates right. And then there's the reality of tax policy, which is the ideologies of various policymakers and who's in charge of Congress and has the White House. So it's really a function, of course, what actual tax policy is going to be of November, what happens in November. I can tell you this, that if there's a Democratic sweep, I would think that the Democrats will really work hard to repeal much of the 2017 tax cut, particularly for corporations. In fact, Joe Biden's already mentioned that he wants to raise the top marginal income tax rate back up to 39.6%, which is where it was under Clinton, and also increase the corporate tax rate. He's from Delaware. He's not especially progressive, as it turns out. He's from Delaware. It's sort of like middle America on the East Coast. But if Democrats sweep, I think that Joe Biden will be induced by the progressive left to try to bring tax rates higher. And part of the narrative there will be to try to reduce the size of the national debt. Now, if the Republicans win, what are they going to do? They're going to stick with what they've got, which is, I think, is a level of taxes that they approve of, that they help to craft. But we'll see. Last I checked, Joe Biden is up 13 points in Florida, so we'll see. But just as when Donald Trump came into office, the effort was try to erase the legacy of Barack Obama's signature accomplishment, Obamacare, the healthcare exchanges, and the Democrats, if they come in, will try to erase the legacy of Donald J. Trump, and they will go after his signature achievement, at least in their mind, which was his tax cuts. So that's, I think, where we're headed.
Thank you. Another question that came in was, what's the chance of the USA going to cashless society or new monetary currency?
Right. So those are two separate questions. So I think that, let me answer the second one first, the new monetary currency, not in our lifetimes. We love our US dollar. It is the reserve currency of the world, meaning the currency that international banks conduct transactions in for the most part and hold their reserves in. So the US dollar is not going anywhere. Now, cashless society, we're moving toward that, right? When was the last time you used a penny in a transaction? And when you get nickels and dimes, you look for ways to give them away. And quarters are valuable only for parking and for to buy Snickers bars. So for vending machines. So cash is already moving in that direction, right? Look at all these new payment systems that we have, right? Zelle or whatever it happens to be, all these, PayPal, Venmo, so on and so forth. We're moving toward a cashless society. We've been moving toward a cashless society. It's going to become digital. We have these digital currencies like Bitcoin. That's where we're headed. It's kind of a scary thing, right? Not to have cash, to be able to hold cash. You have nothing to put in your mattress. You just have things in your computer, and then your computer is vulnerable. So it's a scary time, but we've been moving toward a cashless society, and we'll continue to do so. And I think one of these days, we won't have necessarily currency in our hands. It'll all be digital.
Thank you. I do not see any further questions or anything else in the chat box. Nope, I've got something else that just came in. Where is China in regards to chipping away at U.S. economic dominance and the real information currency?
Yeah, I think China has a lot of going for it. It's a quarter of global manufacturing. It's 1.4 billion people. It is eventually going to be a larger economy than the United States. Here's the key in my mind. Are we going to be the nation that continues to produce the Googles, Intels, Sun Microsystems, Microsofts, whatever the leading technology companies, Amazons of the world? Because right now, we Americans are having a difficult time looking at China and saying, okay, we want to get some of that supply chain back to America for obvious reasons. We want to protect our intellectual property, but we're having difficulty with some of your innovative companies and understanding whether or not we can live with them, whether it's Huawei or TikTok or whatever it happens to be. So we Americans really need to figure out what is our strategy with respect to China. Number one, we need to ask the question, are they an actual enemy? If we conclude that they are, in fact, an actual enemy, that they're striving for global domination along with us, then number two, what is the nature of that war if they're an enemy? Is it a war over information? Is it a war over corporate dominance? Is it a war over intellectual property? What is it about? And then third, how do we win that battle if in fact it's a battle? That's the way we have to look at this. I've said it many times before. It feels like we're at war with China. It's not that conventional warfare. It's not tanks or planes, but it feels like, you know, there really is a tension there, and there are efforts to undermine us. I think the world is better off with America dominating or being the only superpower. That's my feeling. I love capitalism and democracy, and I love two-party systems. I like that. I'm sure there are other people who say, you know, America is a mess right now. Maybe we are, but we're still America. So, you know, we need to figure that out. And you need leadership for that. And we need to have some philosophical discussions about that. And we can't just shut down every great Chinese company that emerges or powerful Chinese company that emerges. So how do we respond when Huawei is a big leader in 5G, or TikTok, you know, begins to gain so many subscribers who are American, often 10 and 11-year-olds? So anyway, long answer to your very pointed question, but we need some leadership around this. And I'm glad that we've begun to address as a nation issues regarding fair trade, but we have to go deeper than that.
Okay, the next question that came in was, how does velocity of money factor into your outlook?
Right, great question. So there is an equation in monetary theory, which is m times v equals p times y. And don't blame me, you asked the question. So m times v equals p times y. So if you take the log of that, you get percentage change m plus percentage change v equals percentage change p plus percentage change y. So percentage change m is a change in money supply. Right now, we have a lot of change in money supply. Percentage change v is the change in velocity, okay? And generally speaking, economists look at velocity, generally speaking, as a constant. It's not a constant, but often we look at it as a constant, which means percentage change v equals 0, as it turns out. So look, if the velocity of money were to pick up, let's say because of all this electronic trading and digital transactions, we see more velocity of money because transactions are just faster. You're not mailing a check anywhere anymore, just instantaneously sending out money. So velocity increases. There's two things that can happen. Percentage change m plus percentage change v equals percentage change p. What's percentage change p? That's a change in the aggregate price level. That's inflation. So one or two things can happen. Percentage change p, which is inflation, or plus percentage change y. Percentage change y is economic growth. Okay? So when you increase money supply and or the velocity of money, you will trigger one of two outcomes. Either price will go up faster, meaning inflation, or output will go up faster. Now, here's the issue. In America, output growth is constrained. Why? We don't have that many workers. Our productivity growth is slow. So if you increase money supply or the velocity of money increases and output is relatively fixed, you just can't grow much faster because you don't have the workers to support faster growth, then what does that do? That triggers more inflation. So the answer to the question is, if the velocity of money picks up, and it could, we'll see more inflation. And that's why I say that in 1 to 2 years, or at least one of the reasons I say that in 1 or 2 years, you and I might be talking about inflation as a problem for the first time in 4 decades. We basically have not talked about inflation as a problem since the early 1980s, but that might be about to change.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question, Anirban. And the last one that we're going to address is, why did you not include the 2009-2010 H1N1 influenza pandemic in your comparison of the negative effect of pandemics?
Right. So again, that chart just came from Goldman Sachs. So we've had H1N1, we've had Zika, we've had Ebola, we've had, there's actually been some recent cases of bubonic plague recently. We've had lots of examples. But H1N1 obviously in 2009 was another example. I will say that in 2009, it's difficult to analyze the effects of H1N1 because that was also amidst the global financial crisis. So it's just hard to make judgments about how much of that was H1N1 and how much of that was just we have a global financial crisis. But GDP in 2009 fell 2.5%, but I doubt it had a lot to do with H1N1. It had to do with other factors. In any case, it's a great question, but that's my answer.
Thank you. And we are at the top of the hour. I want to thank you for this informative, educational, and entertaining presentation. You make economics understandable and enjoyable to listen to. So thank you again. I also want to thank our friends at Symetra for sponsoring this webinar. Again, if you've got any questions, comments, or concerns about any of your cases or anything that you would like to discuss with anyone from Agency 1, please reach out to your case managers, to Dennis, Ed Lesher, Gonzalo Garcia, Ed Stark and his team, and we would be happy to help you. I'd like to advise everyone that this presentation has been recorded and it will be available on the Agency 1 YouTube channel, and the materials will be available on our website. So with that, again, I want to thank you, Anirban, and I wish you a good trip and a safe trip. And I look forward to connecting with you again in the upcoming months. Thank you, everyone. Stay safe.